This is the last complete Tiffany religious interior left intact in its original location in the world.
And this is the only one left, and that's amazing that this survived.
Any town in America would be proud to have and proud to show off to people, but other towns don't have it. Auburn has this.
I've always thought that the chapel should be a vivid reminder of just how much the rest of the country owes to this part of the world.
I didn't like the fact that it was threatened. I did not appreciate at the time the notion that he was going to turn the place into a discotheque.
Ordinary people who really put themselves out on a limb to save the chapel.
So my hat's off to them. I think they deserve a lot of credit for putting their financial welfare and that of their families on the line.
There's a lot more than a building here. There's soul here. It's the souls of the peoples that gave themselves to this place to make it something.
This church building in Auburn, New York, is an important part of America's heritage and a significant work of art recognized around the world. If its carved wooden walls could talk, they would bear witness to some of America's most important political and religious leaders of the past 2 centuries. They would echo the refrains of joyous songs of praise, sung by generations of faithful worshipers. They would tell the story of how one of America's most celebrated designers fashioned a glorious house of worship for a theological seminary in upstate New York, and how a small group of dedicated citizens risked their own futures to preserve this treasure from their past. This is Willard Memorial Chapel, aptly dubbed the Tiffany Treasure of the Finger Lakes. Listed on the National Register of Historic Places, it attracts thousands of visitors each year. But this Tiffany treasure may not immediately jump to mind when people think of Auburn. The city is perhaps better known for some of its other important historical figures and the structures that bear their names. The Seward Mansion, home of Secretary of State William Seward, and the Harriet Tubman Home, a reminder of Auburn's proud legacy on the Underground Railroad. And the city may be best known today for another structure, the imposing concrete walls of the Auburn Correctional Facility. But Willard Chapel is unique, both because of its history and its pedigree. The chapel is the only unaltered religious building in its original location with an interior completely designed by Louis Comfort Tiffany. It is astonishing just how closely tied this building is to some of the most important events and people in history, from upstate New York to the far reaches of the earth. Equally remarkable is how this awe-inspiring chapel survived 3 separate scares that could have destroyed it. The story of Willard Chapel is the testimony of people of faith and vision, people who followed their callings and left a lasting legacy. Willard Chapel and the adjoining Welch Memorial Building were the crown jewels of the Auburn Theological Seminary. Today, they are all that's left of the campus which stood for more than a century at the heart of downtown Auburn. The seminary was founded in 1818, and ground was broken for the first building in 1820.
Why Auburn? Well, it was the biggest town west of Utica at that time. And, well, why do you need a seminary there? Well, because the population is exploding.
Auburn was on the western frontier and in desperate need of ministers who could handle the tough climate and the tough settlers who lived there.
This Presbyterian seminary already in existence, Princeton, was a fairly comfortable place. It had heated rooms, good food, and ministers would be trained in Princeton, and they would come up to central New York, and they would die because the conditions were so tough. Or if they lived, they'd be unsuccessful.
Over the next 30 years, the entire upstate region would be home to profound religious revivals and the founding of major social and religious movements.
A famous historian calls this territory the burned over district. so many waves of religious and social enthusiasm in the 19th century that people began to talk about it as if prairie fires had swept it and then sent those movements out to the rest of the country.
One of the religious movements that started in this region was Mormonism. Years before he would become a famous leader in that religion, a local carpenter named Brigham Young helped construct the seminary's first building. Manual labor was also provided by a neighboring institution, the Auburn Prison. The first warden was a strict military man, but also very religious.
So he decided that it would be very important for the inmates, along with some of his staff, to assist in the building of the seminary. And that started a relationship that went on for years with regard to the seminarians coming into the prison and working with the inmates.
Even after the seminary's removal in 1939, there would still be a strong connection between the prison and Willard Chapel. Reverend Dirk Cornelius Lansing is known as the father of the seminary. He labored for more than 10 years to get funding and support to start it. Reverend Lansing is described as a gentleman preacher of the old school who believed that pastors should preach the whole gospel, not omitting its severe aspects. He was one of the first professors. Because he was also the pastor of Auburn's First Presbyterian Church, and because money was tight in the early days, a recurring theme in the seminary's history, he served without a salary for the first 5 years. Classes started in 1821 with a total of 10 students and 3 professors. It wouldn't take long for Auburn graduates to begin to make their mark on the world. The other professors were Reverend Matthew LaRue Perrine and Reverend Henry Mills. Dr. Perrine's teaching is the first evidence of another historical theme, controversy over church doctrine. Some of the Orthodox Presbyterians from Princeton accused him of heresy, of preaching a different gospel. The difference is minor by today's light, and historians would stoutly defend Perrine from this criticism. But from its inception, Auburn was willing to take risks. In stark contrast to other seminaries, it gladly accepted students from all Christian denominations.
Their concern was bringing people into the church, converting them, changing their hearts, more than it was instructing them in the very fine points of Calvinist doctrine.
2 centuries later, the names Perrine and Lansing live on in Auburn, only a few blocks from Willard Memorial Chapel. Music would play an integral role in the history of the seminary and the chapel. The third professor, Dr. Henry Mills, was the first to publish hymns. He also translated a volume of songs from German to English. From its inception, the goal of the seminary was to spread the gospel of Christ to a heathen world. Even from the earliest days, many of its graduates took the gospel to the farthest reaches of the world. The city of Auburn was the home of William Seward, the Secretary of State under Presidents Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. Seward is widely known as the man responsible for the Alaska Purchase. But because of the seminary, the city of Auburn has an equally important connection to America's other non-contiguous state, Hawaii. By the early 1830s, 11 Auburn men, as they were known, had taken the gospel to the Sandwich Islands in the South Pacific, later to become known as the Hawaiian Islands. At the same time, the burned-over district back in New York was experiencing another wave of religious revival. Titus Cohen was part of the biggest revival in the history of Hawaii. In 1834, Cohen and his new bride, Fidelia, sailed for 6 months to reach the islands. When they arrived, they found thousands of people eager to receive the message.
They would follow him from village to village. Every year at least, he toured on foot the island of Hawaii and preaching and preaching. One time he preached 3 sermons before breakfast, and they literally did not give him time to eat often.
Over several years, Cohen's church had grown to more than 5,000 members, making it the largest Protestant church in the world. The King of Hawaii was baptized, along with other prominent islanders.
The Lord of the Volcano, who was a drunken, adulterous man, just very bad, that came to one of Cohen's meetings, fell down on his knees and repented, and was converted that day, which made a giant influence on everyone else there, let alone on the history of the islands.
After more than 35 years, the famous missionary and his wife returned to visit the mainland.
He was here for months. There was 35,000 people waiting at the docks when he came back to Hawaii. That's the impact.
So vital were Titus Cohen's contributions that the Kingdom of Hawaii's first constitution referred to it as a Christian nation. Many other Auburn men found a fertile mission field as well. Reverend Lowell Smith founded Kaumakapili, the first church for common people on the Big Island. Many generations have been touched by his legacy.
Growing up there, I had very good memories of a good Hawaiian fellowship with people, that all of us believing in the same God and in the salvation that comes through Jesus Christ, we were able to practice that which was taught to us by missionaries from long ago.
Today, Kaumakapili is a thriving church community, active in many ministries and outreaches on the Big Island. But they've never forgotten the Auburn men who got them started.
We celebrate Founders Day in November of every year, where we go to Oahu Cemetery, where Lo and Abigail Smith are buried, and the Sunday school has a service for them there where the children are reminded of who they were, where they are, and who their family or their descendants become.
Lorenzo Lyons of the seminary's class of 1831 became the widest-read non-native author in Hawaiian history. He is most famous for translating over 900 hymns from English to Hawaiian. His hymns are still sung in churches on the island to this day. Auburn missionaries became prominent figures on the islands. Over time, their children grew up to play important roles in Hawaiian religion, business, education, and politics. Some played important roles in the U.S. annexation of the islands. Sereno Edwards Bishop, born to missionary parents in Hawaii, went to school on the mainland and graduated from Auburn Theological Seminary in 1851. Bishop was a pastor as well as a highly renowned scholar in many fields. He is credited as the first person to document a ring of light that appears around the sun after a volcano, a phenomenon now known as the Bishop's Ring. He was also the editor of a prominent magazine called The Friend, and is credited with coining the phrase that has been used ever since to describe Hawaii as the crossroads of the Pacific. Reverend Bishop's writings were very influential. They helped persuade the United States to annex the islands, a move that would eventually lead to Hawaiian statehood. The missionary spirit carried Auburn men to every inhabited continent on the globe. Auburn graduates traveled to Ceylon, Siam, Burma, Persia, China, India, Patagonia, Australia, and Africa. The missionaries were not always greeted as warmly as they were in Hawaii. This 1896 newspaper article tells how Reverend Henry Samuel Barnum was nearly killed as a missionary to Turkey.
Harput was invaded by Kurds and Turks. They joined in bombarding the college with 2 cannon. I was shot at twice at short range but escaped. Reverend H.S. Barnum, with his wife and daughter, had just left the church as it was blown up with a bomb.
Another one of the most historically significant graduates was Reverend Guido Verbeck of the class of 1854. This Auburn man is considered one of the most important foreigners in the history of modern Japan. He helped translate the Bible into Japanese. He taught English, German, and Dutch. And over time, he built trust.
You've got to remember there was a hatred of foreigners. Foreigners were supposed to stay in port treaty areas, and he was able, over time, to move out and live with the natives, which was very important in the future roles.
Verbeck's students were among the most powerful and influential figures in Japanese politics and culture. They included the first prime minister, the founders of the Japanese Army and Navy, and a host of leaders in the Meiji Restoration movement. At the request of his students, Verbeck helped establish the Imperial Tokyo University. He would later be awarded the Order of the Rising Sun, an extremely rare honor for a foreigner. Verbeck lamented the fact that he only accomplished 2 baptisms in his first 12 years there, but his work was not in vain.
He was able to set the stage for other missionaries to go in. He was the trailblazer.
Because of Verbeck's work, many young Japanese men would later attend Auburn Theological Seminary and return to plant churches in their native land. Today, at Willard Chapel, there are still reminders of the seminary's influence in the land of the rising sun. This Japanese larch tree is believed to have been a gift from a grateful graduate. Verbeck's son, William, was the first white Christian boy born in Japan after the ports were opened. He grew up to become a general and later the longtime headmaster of a private school in Manlius, now known as Manlius Pebble Hill. Before the campus closed, more than 140 missionaries had gone to foreign lands, but graduates didn't have to move around the world to leave their mark on it. Reverend Ralph Philbrook graduated in 1929, married in the chapel, and then moved across the street to become pastor of St. Luke's Church on Seminary Avenue. He served for 33 years, becoming a prominent member of the Auburn community. Dr. Philbrook also carried on an important tradition from the early days of the seminary. He served as a prison chaplain for 13 years. Maltby Davenport Babcock, of the class of 1883, left a musical legacy. He became a pastor in Lockport and later in Baltimore, and then at the influential Brick Presbyterian Church in New York City. Babcock wrote the words to the famous hymn, "This Is My Father's World," which still appears in many Protestant hymnals. The song remains so well loved that it was recently recorded by Christian pop singers Amy Grant and Jason Cork. For students and faculty, there was always a strong social component to the gospel message. The seminarians were involved in the temperance movement, which eventually led to the prohibition of alcohol. They were involved in the women's suffrage movement, and as early as 1834, the campus was home to a secret anti-slavery society.
We have a letter from Robert Cox, an attorney in Auburn, who was a big leader of the Underground Railroad in Auburn. He estimated that they helped 500 fugitive slaves through Auburn, and he mentioned that in the summer months, he housed them at the Theological Seminary.
Many graduates took the anti-slavery message with them when they became pastors and used their pulpits to preach an abolitionist message. Some of them set an example by opening their homes as stops on the Underground Railroad. The town of Sennett became known as a safe haven.
Fugitive slaves or freedom seekers could roam without being too concerned about being reported and turned over during the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. And we have evidence that other fugitive slaves stayed in the Sennett area because it was a pocket of peace.
The historian's office also found at least one professor who broke the law to help free slaves. Ezra Abel Huntington used his house on the seminary grounds as a stop on the Underground Railroad. The house is still standing today, not far from Willard Chapel. The seminary prided itself on its orthodox doctrine and its excellence in scholarship. Its professors were highly respected academics whose expertise ranged from sacred rhetoric and Christian theology to Middle Eastern geography and archaeology. Starting with the very first graduating class of 1824, Auburn graduates went on to make major contributions in academia. From that first class of 1824, Reverend Stephen Peet became a co-founder of Beloit College and of the Chicago Theological Seminary. More than a dozen others would go on to become presidents or founders of more than 20 colleges, universities, and seminaries. With such a prominent reputation, it's no wonder that Auburn was a major player in the biggest theological debates within the Presbyterian Church. In 1837, the church split into 2 camps, the New School and the Old School. At the General Assembly that year, New School graduates were turned away.
The Exscinding Act of 1837 declared that the synods of upstate New York and the Western Reserve were not Presbyterian and had never been so.
The delegates who weren't seated regrouped and retreated to Auburn. They issued a statement proclaiming that they were in fact Orthodox Presbyterian Christians. When the two sides finally reunited after the Civil War, this Auburn Declaration was adopted as one of the bases for reunion. While the seminary maintained an excellent reputation, it often encountered financial difficulties. A Spartan institution from its inception, supporters devised creative ways to make ends meet.
They did a lot with land. I found records in the financial books that they had someone, an agent for the Oklahoma land rush, for the Ohio land rush. When people would die, they would leave estates to the seminary to help them go. So there were a lot of farms that the seminary acquired over the years.
The seminary would pay for improvements on the land, adding roads, sidewalks, and sewers, and then sell it for a profit, often holding the mortgages for these properties. But these investments were not always enough. The seminary closed for a year in 1854. The financial difficulties would resurface in later years. The first major threat to the chapel happened 20 years before it ever came to be. In 1873, the seminary was again in desperate need of money, and longtime supporter Colonel E.B. Morgan of Aurora, one of the founders of Wells Fargo and also of the New York Times, offered to build a new campus and provide an endowment. But there was one big catch. He wanted the school to move to Aurora, near the site of Wells College. The situation was dire, but just as the board was reading over his offer, Colonel Morgan presented another letter.
Gentlemen, I have been deeply impressed with the proceedings of this meeting, and for the first time have been made aware of the great interest of the citizens of Auburn in this institution. The offerings of the ladies and children, of the young men and those least able to bear the burdens of society, have struck a chord in my nature that larger contributions from the wealthy could not have done.
Colonel Morgan told board members that if they could raise $225,000 in 60 days, he would donate another $75,000 and the seminary would remain in Auburn. But with 3 days left, they found themselves more than $50,000 short. They spent much of that time in earnest prayer. With only 15 minutes to go before the deadline, 10 members of the committee decided to borrow the remaining money. Their efforts were rewarded, and the campus was saved. As we see time and time again in the story of Willard Chapel, history repeats itself. In 1957 and again in 1989, two small, dedicated groups of people would make similar sacrifices to save this Tiffany treasure from destruction. As soon as they had secured the $300,000, the board members decided to build a new dormitory. They named it Morgan Hall. In 1880, Dr. Sylvester Willard, the secretary of the Board of Trustees and a longtime supporter of the seminary, donated another $10,000.
Sylvester Willard was a businessman and a practicing physician. He was the president for decades of the Oswego Starch Factory, and he gave generously to the causes that he believed in, many of a religious nature.
Dr. Willard died in 1886 after 40 years of service on the board. His wife, Jane Frances Case Willard, died shortly thereafter in 1890. Their names and labors would soon be memorialized at the seminary they loved. 1890 also saw the passing of beloved Professor Dr. Ransom Bethune-Welch, who had taught Christian theology for 14 years. When he died, he left $36,000 for a new chapel and new classrooms. The classroom building adjoining the chapel would be named in honor of Professor Welch. Dr. Sylvester Willard's fortune went to his two daughters, Georgiana and Caroline.
Like many 19th century women, particularly of the upper classes, Caroline and Georgiana Willard led rather retiring lives. They did read widely, they were patrons of particular artists, and they were extremely generous supporters of various causes within the community.
The Willard sisters thought a new chapel would be the perfect tribute to their loving parents. They donated $50,000. They also opened the door to hiring Louis Comfort Tiffany, a well-known glassmaker and designer from New York City.
I know that in their heyday, they split their time between Auburn and New York, and they did have a social relationship with Mr. Tiffany, and they impressed upon that relationship to have him design their chapel.
They asked Louis to design and make the memorial window, which is the window with Jesus and Peter on the water. When he came to see the site, because the buildings weren't built, he wanted to see the site, he met with the Board of Trustees and the sisters. And at the end of the meeting, he stated that his artisans would do the whole interior.
Ground was broken for the two buildings in October of 1892. The Romanesque exterior, made of Cayuga limestone and trimmed with Portage sandstone, was designed by Rochester architect A.J. Warner. But it was the exquisite interior of the chapel that captivated the public when the building was dedicated in 1894. By that time, Tiffany was already a well-known decorator and designer. It was certainly a feat for this small school to hire him for the project.
He was expensive. You had to have money to afford him, and some of his lamps that were made cost more than most people at the time made in a year's salary.
The chapel would be a showcase for Tiffany to demonstrate many of his famous techniques and to experiment with others.
If you explore this building, you can see a lot of Tiffany's earliest design ideas. So one of his innovations was called drapery glass. To make the folds in a gown or a piece of cloth, he actually had the folds in the glass surface. There are huge chunks of glass that stick out in an inch and a half to almost 2 inches from the surface of the window itself. Tiffany was known for plating his windows. By that I mean he'd have more than one layer of glass leaded on top of each other.
And one of the reasons they developed that is up until that time, windows were heavily painted. Paint was applied to the windows to modulate the light, but it tended to make the windows flat and not exciting. And Tiffany, among others, wanted to bring back the glory of the glass itself.
We had a visitor come in once whose father worked under Tiffany, and he said that he, as a child, he remembers seeing Louis Comfort Tiffany walking around the factory, and he always had a cane with him. And when the glass was finished, they'd take the big sheet of glass out and he would look at it. If he didn't like it, he would take that cane and smash the whole pane of glass.
But the windows are not Tiffany's only work at the chapel.
The mosaic is an excellent example of Tiffany's work. It's tiny little pieces of glass set into plaster, and many of them have gold or silver foil put on the back to give it a more reflective and light-giving look.
The mosaic was designed by Tiffany, but signed by one of his top artisans, Jacob Adolf Holzer. The inscription honors Dr. Sylvester Willard and his wife, and quotes the Apostle Paul's first epistle to the Thessalonians. Remembering without ceasing your work of faith and labor of love and patience of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ. A newspaper article from the chapel's dedication explains the other symbolism.
The majestic angel in center symbolizes hope. The woman seated next to the column on the left symbolizes faith. With a pen, she writes the truth, illuminated by a lamp which represents the Holy Spirit. The young boy behind her, holding a cross, is John the Baptist, the prophet who foretold the coming of the Christ. Draped from the cross he holds is the inscription from the Gospel of John. Behold the Lamb of God, that taketh away the sins of the world. On the right side of the tablet sits another woman, deep in thought, representing the virtue of charity. A smaller angel holds a shield, which the woman sees as a mirror, depicting a widow and orphan, symbolically receiving gifts from the charitable.
Almost 100 years after it was built, the mosaic would play a large role in helping determine the fate of the chapel. The chandeliers would also come into play.
The chandeliers are not what a lot of people think of as Tiffany chandeliers. They're not these floral type of chandeliers, but it's a whole style of chandelier that he designed for churches and institutional buildings, and they're very, very good.
Tiffany also designed the woodwork in the chapel, the beading on the pews and pulpit, the paneling on the walls, and even the Moore-esque arches. Unless someone points them out, most visitors don't even notice the stenciled Celtic designs that rise to the top of the wood-paneled ceilings. It's easier to spot Tiffany's influence on the floor tiles. Every square was produced at Tiffany's studio in Queens and assembled so perfectly here that the floor feels as smooth as marble. The windows on the sides show geometric designs and abstract patterns. This was another of Tiffany's innovations.
Previous to him, that was not the common thing to see, and he was interpreting the spiritual nature of chapels and churches through landscapes and beautiful designs as opposed to more strict interpretations of stories from the Bible.
But Tiffany's design is profoundly rich with symbolic themes from Christian art. The windows above the organ incorporate the symbols of the ox, the lion, the man, and the eagle, originally part of Ezekiel's vision from the 6th century BC. The same symbols appear again in the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible. They took on new meaning to later Christian writers as early as the 2nd century AD.
People associated those 4 creatures that we find in Ezekiel and Revelation with the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it's said in Christian lore that each of those creatures symbolizes something about the characteristics of that gospel. So that Matthew so emphasizes the incarnation that the symbol of the man is appropriate. That Mark, in a sense, roars like a lion. Luke, perhaps it sounds less flattering, but it's not meant to be, sort of plods along like an ox and gets the work done. And John soars like an eagle. It's the most mystical of the Gospels.
On the back wall, above the mosaic tablet, is a stunning figural window. It is based on a painting by English artist Frederick Shields called Christ Sustaining Peter on the Water, taken from the story described in the Gospel of Matthew. It is a brilliant example of Tiffany's plating technique.
There are places where that window is 7 layers of glass thick, and many places where it's 4 layers thick to get the depth of color and the shading that Tiffany wanted.
What they were doing was they were giving a little three-dimensionality to the figures, making the figures work and eliminating the flatness of the window when you look at it.
Tiffany's craftsmanship and artistic techniques help make the window stand out, but to many, the window's meaning goes much deeper than 7 layers of glass.
That picture always touched my heart, and it still does. Because we're all in that position, you know, where the good Lord lifts us out of our problems and strengthens us every day, you know.
And at the time that the Community Preservation Committee got together to undertake this process, you know, there were many nights that we came into the chapel and basically used that window as part of the inspiration of this project, you know, trying to get some help, so to speak.
And I think it's an important symbol where you have this loving Jesus embrace this Peter, because Jesus knows Peter's fallibilities so well, and yet that embrace, I think, is a very warm embrace for everybody who walks in, because if you know what kind of a creature Peter is, hey, this is the guy that's going to deny Jesus. And then you see this warm and rescuing embrace. Well, if that doesn't make you say, boy, you know, if Jesus does that for Peter, Jesus does that for me, what will?
I remember as sitting in church services, and you really didn't get the full grasp of that window unless you were on your knees looking at it. You could stand back and look and be different, but if you're on your knees and looking up, you had a whole different perspective.
The chapel was dedicated on October 24, 1894. The first president of the seminary, Reverend Henry Matthias Booth, gave a lengthy sermon in which he declared that this ornate edifice, this Tiffany masterpiece, was truly a work of Christian art, and that through the architecture and design of the building, the gospel is preached. The sermon put to rest any criticisms that the chapel may be too fancy for a Protestant house of worship, or complaints people may have had about the $250,000 price tag.
Certainly there is a kind of elegance about this. There are many people, Catholic and Protestant, who would say that kind of elegance is perfectly proper because, well, you want to worship in a place that perhaps can even sort of lift you up. This may be a kind of imperfect copy of heaven in some ways. And therefore it is very uplifting and edifying. Other people would say, gee, Jesus or the people of the early church, they didn't take their money and make edifices and buildings and hire fancy decorators. What they did is distributed their money to the poor. The question is, do you want, when you leave here, do you want to go out and say, gee, I want to make so much money, I want to buy myself a Tiffany living room? Or do you say, I'm inspired to listen to the Word of God, and I've listened to it in a kind of calm and beauty. I want to bring beauty to the world, especially to places maybe that don't have it. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean buying a Tiffany chapel and putting it in Zambia, but it might mean sending food and clothing or missionaries or whatever. In other words, there are a lot of different ways that this can inspire.
The early 20th century saw a vibrant, vital seminary. The first female student was matriculated in 1913, making Auburn a leader in training women for the ministry. In 1917, Mrs. Ida Thorne Parker, a Quaker minister in the Society of Friends, became the first woman to graduate. The campus was a center of important theological thought. The faculty featured prominent scholars and influential leaders of the Presbyterian Church. Among them was George Black Stewart, president of the seminary and a professor for 30 years. His leadership and theology would help pave the way for modern liberal Christianity. Stewart's family was very involved in the life of the seminary. His son, Harris Bates Stewart, was a professor and treasurer. His nephew, Weir Stewart, served many years on the board. George Black Stewart's granddaughter, Ann Stewart Birch, has fond childhood memories of the campus and of Willard Chapel.
We went to chapel every Wednesday night. The chapel was used kind of like a student teaching for the students. They were practicing their sermons and so on. And we went, and I tell you, those benches got pretty hard for little kids after a while. But it didn't hurt us to go and sit for an hour, and they were only an hour long, so my father used to say that no souls were saved after the first 20 minutes, and I think that was pretty good advice for ministers or students of ministry.
But George Black Stewart wasn't the only influential professor at the turn of the century. Scottish scholar John Bailey was a leading moderate voice in the church. He would later become co-president of the World Council of Churches and chaplain to the King and Queen in Scotland. Bailey worshipped in Willard Chapel at the same time as another famous professor, Allen Macy Dulles, a liberal theologian who is probably best known for his famous family. His son, John Foster Dulles, became Secretary of State under President Eisenhower and was largely responsible for shaping U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War. Today, travelers who fly to Washington, D.C. recognize his name at Dulles International Airport. Allen Welsh Dulles became the head of the CIA. Under his direction, the CIA successfully overthrew the governments of Iran and Guatemala. Allen Welsh Dulles was forced to resign after President John F. Kennedy blamed him for the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, but he later served on the Warren Commission, which investigated Kennedy's assassination. Professor Dulles's daughter also became a major player in Washington and world politics. Eleanor Dulles, an economist with a Ph.D. from Harvard, became known as the Mother of Berlin for helping revitalize West Berlin's economy and culture during the 1950s. A Bible belonging to Professor Dulles remains in the archives of the chapel. It reminds us that his family's legacy is not only political, but spiritual. Avery Dulles, the son of Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, converted to Catholicism, becoming a Jesuit priest. A prolific scholar, he authored more than 700 books and articles. In 2001, he was made a cardinal of the Catholic Church. In Auburn, there are still reminders of Professor Allen Macy Dulles. His beautiful home on South Street is still standing, but many Auburnians now know it for another reason. It is home to the superintendent of the Auburn Correctional Facility.
I really believe with the relationship between the seminary and the prison, the state of New York decided to buy Mr. Dulles' house on South Street.
The Dulles family connection ties the chapel to some of the most important political decisions that defined East-West relationships for 50 years. Another seminary professor who taught in the Welch Memorial Building and worshiped in Willard Chapel would play a critical role in shaping American Christianity for decades to come. Reverend Robert Hastings Nichols would not only teach church history, but make it. The reunion between the new school and old school had been settled long before the Welch Building and Willard Chapel were built. But as these beautiful structures were being erected, some of the first rumblings were being felt in one of the most important doctrinal struggles in Presbyterian history, a conflict that would shape the future of the church through the 20th century and beyond. Who could know at the time that this tiny campus would play such a decisive role in its outcome? Or that the faculty of Auburn Theological Seminary would craft a document that would keep the Presbyterian Church from splitting. This famous document, a centerpiece for liberal Christianity in the 1920s, would become known as the Auburn Affirmation. As the 19th century came to a close, the church struggled to deal with profound social and intellectual changes. The Industrial Revolution, Darwin's theory of evolution, and the development of the social sciences changed the cultural landscape forever. Modernist or liberal thinkers in the church realized these changes brought a new worldview, a perspective that would examine scriptures critically from a scientific and historical approach. Led by such well-known theologians as Henry Sloane Coffin and Harry Emerson Fosdick, they wanted to tailor the message of the gospel to make it compatible with this new worldview.
Unless you expose young people to what's going on in modern science and modern studies, they're going to go away to college and they're going to lose the faith because look what these people are telling me. Why didn't somebody else tell me?
The modernists questioned the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. They also questioned the historical reliability of the Gospels. These modernists claimed they believed in these doctrines, but that it wasn't necessary to require all Christians or all Presbyterian ministers to believe in them.
Conservatives, of course, on the other hand, saw liberals as denying doctrines that were fundamental to the faith, all of which went to the supernatural gospel, and understood that in essence, liberalism, as J. Gresham Machen held, was a different religion than Christianity, and therefore liberals ought not to be proclaiming the gospel in the Presbyterian Church.
Fundamentalist leaders like J. Gresham Machen argued that if the historical facts of the gospel could not be trusted, then by definition it could not be the gospel or good news. Machen argued that if the church would give up these fundamentals, then no doctrine would be safe. He predicted a slippery slope, a church that would become increasingly secular and eventually deny the very necessity of Christ himself. Around the turn of the century, liberal ideas were advancing rapidly, but facing strong opposition.
In 1910, the General Assembly of the Church adopted a declaration stating that the inerrancy of Scripture, the virgin birth, substitutionary atonement, bodily resurrection, and miracle-working powers of Christ were essential and necessary articles of the faith, and that all of those who were to be licensed or ordained in the Presbyterian Church needed to be able to subscribe to those doctrines.
Those 5 doctrines were called the 5 fundamentals, and the conservatives became known as fundamentalists, a term still used today to describe conservative Christians. But the liberal presbyteries in New York and the Northeast kept ordaining men who did not believe in these doctrines. The actions by the General Assembly had serious implications for the seminarians at Auburn.
I imagine those students were pretty nervous about what was going to happen to them. So there were probably many discussions in class and in those corridors you can still walk through today about whether they could serve in this denomination if the fundamentalists won.
In 1916 and again in 1923, the General Assembly again reiterated the 5 fundamentals as mandatory for ordination. the conservative Presbyterian newspapers were full of personal attacks against the modernists.
They're liberals, they're Richleyians, they're indifferentists, they're nullifiers. And then in the polemics of the mid-20s, and here's where I think the fundamentalists made a terrible mistake, they would keep tossing around these words, attacking their opponents, as really not being Christian, authentic Christians.
The Auburn Affirmation and its signatories certainly affirmed that they were sincere evangelical Christians and made a distinction between doctrines and facts and theories.
The conflict threatened to split the church, but one man was determined to quell the controversy.
The key figure in the whole story is Robert Hastings Nichols, who was a professor of church history at Auburn. And he was the organizational genius, as well as the author of most of the document itself.
Nichols campaigned tirelessly behind the scenes to get moderates and liberals to sign on to his paper. By the General Assembly of 1924, 150 ministers had signed it.
And then more people wanted to sign it after it was published. And so ultimately this ended up at about 1,300 Presbyterian ministers. But of those 1,300, 20% were Auburn graduates.
The Auburn Affirmation appealed to the moderate Presbyterians who valued liberty of thought and unity in the church. But perhaps its most persuasive argument was purely political. Nichols argued that by mandating these 5 fundamentals, the General Assembly had overstepped its bounds and illegally amended the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church. To legally amend it, the General Assembly and the local presbyteries would have to agree to any changes. In 1925, on the verge of a church split, the moderator of the General Assembly proposed a commission to study the issue.
That commission decided that the Auburn Affirmation was right, that they could not be imposed on ministers because they weren't part of the church's confession of faith. They reported that to the 1927 Assembly, and everybody agreed with it, even the fundamentalists. So the church was kept in one piece.
Robert Hastings Nichols had labored for more than 2 years to see this outcome.
He confessed to one of the directors of Auburn Seminary in 1924 that he was really neglecting his teaching because of this, and the director reportedly said it's more important to make church history than to teach it, and they did.
And just how has history viewed the work of this church historian from Auburn? In the short run, it was successful. It helped preserve the unity and focus of the Presbyterian Church.
Then here comes the problem where Dr. Longfield and I think are in agreement. This meant that for almost 30 years, you had a moratorium on theology because theology was so divisive.
It looked as if there was little chance that the church would ever abandon the faith of the Westminster Confession or find confusion in that faith. And for many years it seemed as if, in fact, the solution was working. The result, however, in the long term is a little different. I would argue, as I do in my work, that the failure of the church at that stage of the game to articulate a clear normative middle way contributed to the kind of fragmentation that we find in the church in the latter 20th century.
As the Presbyterian Church struggles with contemporary issues, such as defining clear doctrinal boundaries and the ordination of practicing homosexual ministers, echoes of the Auburn Affirmation and this small campus are heard again.
The Auburn Affirmation has been raised in more recent controversies of the church as a document that the church needs to listen to again. And so it is not simply a historical document, but is part of contemporary conversations going on in the church.
Despite its prominence in the fundamentalist modernist controversy, Auburn Theological Seminary in the late 1920s found itself staring once again into the face of serious financial problems. The city of Auburn was no longer a big town on the western frontier. Enrollment levels declined. Under the leadership of President George Black Stewart, the seminary continued to attract many foreign students, especially from Japan, and developed new programs to help bring in money.
That's when they started the School of Religious Education. They did a lot of firsts here at the Auburn Seminary, training Sunday school teachers. It was actually an accredited course that they did here. And every time they got something successful, the other seminaries would copy.
The School of Religious Education did more than train Sunday school teachers. It offered many innovative courses for lay people. The courses were very successful, but they were not enough to abate the seminary's deeper financial issues. In early 1929, the seminary unveiled a new capital campaign to raise $1.25 million. It was a front-page story every month in the alumni newsletter, The Chapel Bell. $250,000 was earmarked for improving the buildings. There was even talk of renovating the Tiffany interior of Willard Chapel.
That's almost 40 years, 1929, from when the chapel was built. That's a long time to go with the same decoration.
By this point, Tiffany had fallen out of favor as a decorator.
They say that when his store closed on Fifth Avenue, they took an entire barge load of Tiffany lamps and dumped them in the East River because they couldn't sell them.
Louis Comfort Tiffany had decorated the White House completely. And when Teddy Roosevelt came in, he did not like the decor, and he threw everything out.
The Victorian era was long over, and that's why in 1929 they wanted to get rid of the Tiffany. A lot of people figured the Victorian era was almost depressing.
But the chapel was a source of pride for alumni and faculty alike. Whether they would have followed through on plans to remove the Tiffany interior, we'll never know. The campaign was brought to a screeching halt in late October. It ended up raising $300,000, but it wasn't nearly enough. The Great Depression would prove too much to overcome. The seminary continued to find other ways to make money. In 1934, it leased some campus space to the Auburn Collegiate Center, part of a Depression-era program run in conjunction with Syracuse University and the State College of Forestry. Originally designed to provide jobs for unemployed college professors, the Collegiate Center soon realized an expanded mission of providing 2 years of higher education for young men and women who couldn't otherwise afford it. Students paid no tuition if they brought a note from their parents swearing their inability to pay the costs of attending another college or university. They paid only a $1 fee for each course, plus the cost of books. Classes were held in the Welch Building, and students even practiced their public speaking from the pulpit of the chapel. Many would transfer to Syracuse University or other four-year colleges. But despite its success, the Collegiate Center closed in 1938 when federal funding dried up. In the early 1930s, the seminary's boards knew they were facing a crisis. They appointed a commission to study the future of the seminary. In 1934, the commission reported budget deficits in every year from 1927 on. At this rate, the deficits would soon eat away everything in the endowment funds. As they had in the past, the professors volunteered to take pay cuts. They suggested having students earn their keep by working on the campus grounds. They even suggested keeping the campus in Auburn, but having it specialize in only religious education or specialize in training rural ministers.
There certainly was a lot of discussion, and they did not want to move, but economically it was the only thing they could do.
One proposal was to remove the seminary to Ithaca and establish an affiliation with Cornell University. The directors eventually decided the best option was to remove to Rochester and create an affiliation with the Colgate-Rochester Divinity School. To make it happen, they would need to raise $325,000 to put up a new building. But times were tough. Alumni and friends of the seminary were all tapped out after the 1929 campaign, and many did not want the school to move. It soon became apparent they would not be able to raise the funds. In October of 1938, after exhausting every possible alternative, the board of directors made the painful decision to discontinue operations at the end of the school year and dispose of the campus property.
At the very last moment, when the seminary was going to have to simply close its doors, Henry Sloane Coffin, who'd been a leader in the drafting of the Auburn Affirmation and president of Union Seminary, extended the hand of friendship, said, "Come as you are, bring any faculty and students you want." He didn't propose merger. He didn't propose taking over the seminary's few remaining assets. It was an amazing act of institutional generosity. And so it's remained. Auburn and Union have never merged. When people ask me how long we've been married, I say, well, we never did. We've just been happily shacked up together for almost 70 years.
The seminary had survived, but what about the campus in Auburn? What would become of Willard Chapel, Welch Hall, Morgan Hall, the Silliman Clubhouse, and all the other beautiful buildings? The seminary hoped to sell the property as soon as possible. In 1939, the board published a booklet to give to prospective buyers. The description of Willard Chapel shows just how beloved the chapel was. When it was thought that the seminary would remove to Rochester, the beauty of the chapel prompted the seminary officials to plan to take the building apart, remove it to Rochester, and have it re-erected there. To the seminary's dismay, no buyers came forward to purchase the property. In 1941, the seminary leased parts of the campus to the National Youth Administration, a New Deal program to provide vocational training and paid jobs for young men and women. The Youth Administration was a pet project of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who personally toured the Auburn site. Classes were held in the Welch Memorial Building and in other campus buildings.
My job was to teach them blueprint reading, and we had auto mechanics, machine shop, and they even bent their own tailpipes and exhaust systems to put on automobiles.
It was at this time that the warehouse-style building, later to become the City Garage, was erected on Nelson Street. The program lasted until Congress cut funding in 1944, but the National Youth Administration wasn't the only government agency using the campus during World War II. The military also leased space.
Right after the war broke out, as a place to train the Seabees. And if you remember the John Wayne movie, where the Seabees wanted to carry weapons, and they were civilian operators that worked for the government. And the Navy Department said, well, we can do this, but you're going to have to go to basic training. And here in Auburn and in Haledon, New Jersey, were the first two places where they trained the Seabees.
The Army also leased space for special military training provided through Syracuse University. At one time, the Army, the Navy, and the National Youth Administration were all vying for use of the seminary space. The government ended the lease in 1944, and the seminary continued to search for other buyers. After several dead ends, a potentially promising lead came along. Representatives from the Baptist Bible College in Johnson City toured the facilities and asked for more information. The seminary offered to sell the entire campus for $350,000. An unsigned letter to board member Weir Stewart shows some distrust of the Baptists.
Sometimes, also, these fundamentalist brethren achieve a queer twist in their Christian ethics. To them, we liberals are sometimes considered almost anti-Christ. And once safely settled, they might easily feel they are doing the will of God and preventing us from having their money to spend in our nefarious business. On the other hand, it will be much better for our country in the long run to have the aggressive fundamentalists on the job and growing than for the country to be progressively taken over by the Roman Catholic hierarchy.
Whether it was distrust or some other reason, the sale to the Baptist Bible College never materialized, and the seminary would end up selling off the property one piece at a time. When the war ended, GIs came home to find a severe shortage of housing. The seminary leased its dormitories to New York State, which in turn rented them to returning servicemen and their families. Even the classrooms of the Welch Memorial Building were divided up into apartments. One resident of the Welch Building was Paul Lattimore, a World War II airman who would later become a 4-term mayor of Auburn. Paul Lattimore II was about 5 years old at the time.
The property was beautiful, the buildings were great, and the lifestyle was seemed to be a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun in those days.
The Lattimore family continues to be very active in local politics. The seminary campus was used for housing until 1953, but the chapel itself was kept under lock and key and was only used on rare occasions for weddings and other events. When the leases ran out, the seminary was still looking to unload the property. The city encouraged it to turn the land into commercial property. Eventually, all of the beautiful buildings on the campus would be demolished. all except for the chapel and the Welch Building. A grocery store, a drugstore, and a high-rise senior housing building would spring up. Later, a liquor store would take root on the site of the seminary campus where faculty had been leaders in the temperance movement. How would the chapel escape a similar fate? While the rest of the seminary's buildings were sold off and torn down, a local congregation stepped forward to buy it. The next chapter in the life of Willard Chapel would span more than 3 decades. The Auburn congregation that saved this Tiffany treasure from the wrecking ball would share some remarkable parallels with the seminary. The Seventh-day Adventist denomination has its roots in one of the important revivals of the burned-over district in the 1830s and 40s. Founded in Lowhampton, New York by William Miller, Adventism quickly spread throughout the U.S. and Canada. Miller studied prophecies in the Bible and became convinced of an imminent second coming of Christ, or Second Advent. One historian writes that Miller's theology virtually epitomized orthodoxy, except for one crucial element. Based on his own calculations from numbers found in Old and New Testament prophecies, Miller became convinced that Christ would return to judge the world and that it would happen by October 22, 1844. What followed became known as the Great Disappointment. When Christ did not return, the Millerites split into 4 main groups. The most prominent of these groups became known as the Seventh-day Adventists. Led by a young woman named Ellen White, they followed Orthodox Protestant preaching with an emphasis on 2 points. The 7th day of the week, Saturday, is the Sabbath, and Christ is coming soon to judge the world. In 1850, Ellen White and her husband James lived near Port Byron and published some of the very first Seventh-day Adventist periodicals in Auburn. But Adventists in Cayuga County were few in number. Eventually, they grew, and in 1950 began fundraising for a building of their own. But they were planning to build a new church. They had no plans to take over the vacant Willard Chapel. In 1957, they reconsidered the chapel and made a $10,000 purchase offer, but the seminary wanted more. The Adventists made another offer of $12,000. This time, the seminary said yes. The building that had once been the crown jewel of the campus was now sold for a pittance. The $12,000 was not even 5% of what it had cost to build in 1892. For the Adventists, the purchase was a miracle, an answer to many prayers. But the chapel and Welch Memorial Building would need some serious fixing up before they could move in.
Well, it didn't look too terrible promising, but it was a church. It wasn't much to look at, as I recall, when we first went in there. It was like an old haunted house that had been left neglected, maybe used on October 31 and then shut down again. It was spooky.
There was much work to be done, but for the Adventists, it soon became a labor of love.
The people really were excited about having this as their own because they'd been meeting in other people's churches and at one time in a Masonic lodge, and this was really the first place they had gotten for themselves, and they really liked it.
They put up drop ceilings in the Welch Building and installed a new heating system. In the chapel itself, all the paint on the walls was cracked and peeling. Some 50 years later, critics would lament the fact that the Adventists changed the color of the terracotta paint on the walls and painted over the stencils on the organ pipes. But the Adventists saw deterioration that the critics didn't see.
And all the chandeliers, of course, were kind of rusty looking, and the pipes on the organ were rusty. They all had to be taken down, sanded, and painted with gold. The chandeliers, I can remember Paul Smith getting up and getting them down. That was quite a project to get them down without breaking anything. And the chains and everything were spray painted with gold.
I stood at the sink washing those prisms, getting them clean, and someone else dried them, and then they put the chandeliers back together.
All the woodwork in the chapel had accumulated a white, mold-like substance that had to be cleaned. The dilapidated condition of the wood was too much for some of the church members, but the majority saw beauty instead of ashes.
Some people, when we moved in, wanted to take wood away, and we said, oh no, we got to leave it the way it was, because we didn't want to, you know. Some people said, much easier to take the wood off and paint it, but it wasn't. It would have been a shame.
The years of neglect had left the exterior of the chapel in need of work as well.
And we found that there were several louvers missing from the bell tower, and that had allowed pigeons to get in there and roost. And pigeon dung was like this deep, so the bell literally would not ring. It wouldn't swing anymore.
After 5 months of cleaning bees and repairs, the Seventh-day Adventist Church was ready to open wide the doors for evangelism at Willard Chapel.
Once we acquired that church, it became the place that every preacher wanted to preach there. Every organist wanted to play that organ. Every music director wanted to bring his or her choir group through there. It was just a place that drew people to it.
What I remember most about the church is when we bought the church, and we went in, and it hadn't been heated for 11 years, and that organ still worked. That amazed me.
As it had in the days of the seminary, the organ provided beautiful worship music for weekly church services and special concerts.
I tell you, the one that made that organ sound off was E. Power Biggs. When he came to Auburn, he had his choice of organs in any church he wanted, and he chose the Tracker organ at the Auburn Church. We had people sitting all the way down the hallway outside of that chapel.
The chapel's acoustics were perfect for music. Under the expert direction of Dr. Margaret Hafner, the Adventist choir performed festive Christmas and Easter concerts. As it had been in the seminary era, the chapel was once again a popular spot for weddings.
We were the second ones to be married in this church after the Adventists bought it. I didn't have a showpiece wedding. I had a simple, nice, quiet wedding, and I enjoyed it.
The chapel also provided a perfect venue for a popular summertime outreach.
Vacation Bible School, one year we had 75 children there. Then we took a picture, and they were all lined up on the steps down below.
Sabbath school and church services were held every Saturday. Between 1957 and 1965, church membership increased from around 80 people to around 120.
When we first came, we looked at all the churches in the neighborhood. And the real thing, it was not so much the beauty of this church, but it was that they had enough children.
A lot of families had a lot of children, and there was a lot of activities. So it was a very active church, a very energetic church.
The Welch Memorial Building was used for the Dorcas Society, a charitable group run by women of the church that gave away free clothing and other items to anyone in need.
Clothing in good repair, clean. They had a washer and dryer right there at the church.
We used to have people in senior citizen home that would make quilts for us to give to people.
It sure was fun, finding clothes for babies and little children, and food.
That was a job that I felt was doing something for the Lord, you know.
The Dorcas Society helped many thousands of people over the decades and became a highly regarded service in the community. Even several years after the Adventists moved out of the chapel, people would still come, looking for the free clothing and food. In the early 1970s, several Adventist laypeople began an outreach to prisoners in the Auburn Correctional Facility. Just as the seminarians had done since the 1820s, these Christians brought Bible teaching and hope to those behind bars.
Even though some inmates might have been there just to get out of their cells, over the course of time it became very important to them.
What they would do is they would go to all the different religious classes. So when they come to our class, they would say, well, the Quakers say this, and the Presbyterians say this, and the Methodists say this, and the Catholics say this, you know, and we would have to explain using the Bible.
In the 1970s and early 1980s, the entire Adventist denomination found itself in the midst of an age-old doctrinal controversy about the role of human works in God's grace and salvation.
The basis of this was perfectionism and sinlessness, and it all involved around the nature of Christ. If Christ was human as we are, then we as humans could achieve perfection.
The same Tiffany Chapel that had played host to debates over the Auburn Affirmation half a century earlier would now bear witness to another conflict over religious doctrine. Dale Wakely had just graduated from the Seventh-day Adventist Seminary and was well-versed in the controversy when he walked into his first pastorate at the Auburn Church. Like the seminarians and fundamentalists before him, he sought answers in the Bible itself.
I have it here. It's one of, if not my most favorite text. It says, "For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." It's a righteousness that was performed by Jesus himself in his daily life, in his obedience to the law, his ultimate sacrifice during the Passion, his death on the cross, a righteousness apart from human works. Adventism at the time, as I remember, insisted that human works was part of that process.
Many in the congregation welcomed this preaching. Others did not. Tension mounted. After several months, Adventist conference leadership gave the pastor an ultimatum.
In the 10th month of my pastorate here, the storm broke, and I was asked to either stop my preaching of that particular teaching, justification by faith, or resign. And since I would not stop preaching what I firmly believe to be the gospel, I resigned my ministry.
As the debate continued through the mid-'80s, the emphasis on human works gradually decreased.
It seemed to me we're trying to bring us closer to grace, move us farther away from an emphasis on law and rules and judgment. And perhaps that was a healthy move for the church at the time.
Just as the seminary had turned out successful graduates who touched the world as pastors, missionaries, leaders, and educators, the Adventist Church in Auburn watched a remarkable number of its young people move on to similar success. At least 3 would become student missionaries or pastors. Others became professors and administrators at Adventist colleges and universities, or taught at Adventist grade schools and boarding schools. At least 2 children who grew up in the church went on to become medical doctors. 2 others became professional musicians.
The sun is setting sweetly on the century, and Jesus sure the man I want to be.
Though each of these Auburn Adventists can share fond memories of the chapel, it is more likely the positive role models in the church, rather than the Tiffany decor, that inspired so many young people to pursue Christian vocations. Professor Brian Strayer cites one particular inspiration: Cornell University research scientist Dr. Malcolm Bourne.
As the youth Sabbath school director, I think he inspired each one of us to develop leadership skills.
The Adventists loved their church at Willard Chapel. In 1964, the grocery store Loblaws offered to buy the property. The church said no. But it wasn't easy being the caretakers of these beautiful buildings for more than 30 years.
They wanted to put more money into evangelism, but their hands were tied with repairs. The clerk's minutes for the 1980s basically are full of the roof is leaking here, we need to replace the pipes over there. I mean, the concern is maintenance and repair.
Vandalism became a concern in the late 1970s. BB guns shot holes in at least 2 of the Tiffany windows. The church had to install deadbolts on the doors after several break-ins.
In each case, they would take the sound system, the amplifier, and microphones, and the last time that they broke in, that's where they came in, is through that stained glass window.
The parallels between the seminary and the Auburn Seventh-day Adventists are numerous. Both had roots in the burned-over district of the 19th century. Both shared a strong connection with the Auburn prison. Both saw young people leave the sanctuary of the chapel to work for the kingdom of God. As the 1970s drew to a close, the Seventh-day Adventist Church would find another parallel with the seminary: financial hardship.
It was costing us a lot of money. We were afraid we were going to have to replace the roof, and the heat bill was just going way out of sight.
We had done all that we could, including jumping 12 inches or blowing 12 inches of insulation over all the ceilings that could be done. We put plexiglass on the Tiffany glass, and we had updated the heating, and yet still to heat the chapel on a winter day would cost between $5,000 and $1,000 for just a church service.
Gradually, they decided that the building was costing them really more than it was worth to maintain.
It would be much more efficient to have a small building. We had a small membership at the time, too, so we really couldn't afford all the things that needed to be done for it.
It was about this time that a small group of preservationists was beginning to realize the historic and cultural value of Auburn's proud and rich heritage. The fledgling Community Preservation Committee did not want the church to sell and offered to help find funding for repairs. But the congregation soon realized that the small amount of grant money they offered was not nearly enough. The Adventists reluctantly realized that they had no choice but to sell their beloved church home.
There were a number of articles which were written, which were very negative about the congregation and indicated that the congregation didn't care about the building and that it didn't matter to us what the future of the building was. It was very discouraging to the congregation that knew what their history had been, how they had taken the building over when, at a time when it looked to be that it was going to be destroyed in the first place.
The church paid a local realtor to conduct an appraisal on the building.
We received the document which told us that it was valued at $125,000, which seemed to us, of course, very discouraging and a very, very low valuation.
The plot would thicken the very next day.
We received under the front doors of the building an offer to purchase the building. And the offer was exactly $125,000.
Pastor Wade had a long talk with the buyer, who admitted someone from the realtor's office had given him inside information about the appraisal.
I hope it's okay for a pastor to say I was not happy. I was very upset. It meant that they were going to have to come up with that much more financing to purchase and build a new structure.
But the congregation decided not to take legal action. They eventually found some property on Prospect Street. Enter the young entrepreneur who would now play a pivotal role in the future of this Tiffany masterpiece. Antiques dealer Mike Dwyer had heard rumors of the suspiciously low appraisal and realized the buildings were worth much more.
You know, it was worth more than $100,000. And I thought too, you know, and I was willing to meet that, the offer that they needed to build a new church. And so, you know, and I thought if I got hurt on it, I would have moved into it or did something with it.
We just figured we'd been praying that we could get something that we'd be able to handle. And we just figured that that was the answer to our prayer when you know, when he came along.
I went to the chapel and I found out that they were thinking of selling it. And I says, well, what would you, if you could get more money for it, would you be interested in selling it? So I think that perked their ears up a little bit.
The man kept coming up on his price, and I think we finally got $250,000 for it.
So I told him that I would be willing to meet the figure, that I would meet that figure, but that I'd want an offer within, you know, I'd want an answer within 48 to 72 hours. Because they'd already been through the process, and I felt that if it got out, there was going to be a headache about it, because when I walked into the chapel, I just couldn't believe how, you know, it was just incredible. And I thought maybe that, you know, the city would put a kibosh on the sale, or somebody would.
The Historical Society wanted us to hold off. We told them we would hold off if they could come up with the money. At the time, they didn't have the money. And so it was either forget the sale or sell. So it was sold.
The Community Preservation Committee had no way to meet the Adventists' asking price. Little did they know they would soon be asked to raise nearly twice that much to save the chapel and Welch building. After the sale, the Adventists would face another barrage of negative publicity.
I had one friend that come to me and said, well, why would you sell that, a beautiful church like that? He said, I've never been in there. I said, this church has been open for the public for the last 30 years and you've never been in it. I said, so why do you want to go in it now?
The Adventists sold the building in 1988 and moved forward with their building project on Prospect Street. The architect was Edwin Demerit of New Orleans, who had designed many churches across the United States. He was also a Seventh-day Adventist who had been married in Willard Chapel in 1960. The Adventists had many beautiful memories of Willard Chapel, but it was time to move on.
So God took us into the church and God took us out of it. And I didn't have anything to do with that other than moving this stuff out and in.
As the Adventists built their new church home, Willard Chapel and the Welch Memorial Building were under new ownership and under a new threat. How could a young businessman turn a profit on his investment? Sell it, of course.
I wasn't in a position of being 25 years old and having a young family and whatever to be able to maintain it. I mean, if a church congregation couldn't maintain it, there's no way I could have.
Mike Dwyer knew the building was worth far more than the $125,000 appraisal provided by the local realtor, and worth more than the $250,000 he paid for it. But even he had no idea just how valuable his new property was. He didn't have to wait long to find out. A Tiffany expert from New York City heard about the building and wanted to come take a look.
He saw the plaque and he thought it was incredible. And he made me an offer of $1 million over to a gentleman over in Japan. He thought that he could brokerage it to.
Mike had Christie's auction house, New York City, come through and do an appraisal of all of the different pieces. At the time, they were putting together a brochure, a catalog, and as they explained it, it was going to be a sole source auction. It was just going to be on this one building. And at the time, the Japanese were very much interested in the Tiffany stuff.
The reason the building was in danger was because the owner had it in his mind that he would disassemble the building, essentially the building's interior, and sell it at auction.
Michael Dwyer was there when I came in. There was nobody else there. And he was telling me about his plans for the building. See the frieze on the wall, the golden frieze? He said that's going to a museum in Ohio. He said, you see the chandeliers? They're all going to different homes in Long Island. See that organ? It's going to a place in Vermont.
Christie's had hired Alistair Duncan from New York City to come up and do a thorough appraisal. And the second phone call I got was from Alistair Duncan saying, don't let him do this. Basically saying that according to what he understood, that this is probably the only one left in existence in the world where Tiffany did everything.
He was saying that this is probably the most important building ever that Tiffany had designed.
So at that point in the conversation, I said to Mike, well, let me understand this. If you don't get the payment within 2 months, you're going to strip it, and if they do pay for it after 3 months, they're going to have a shell of a building inside. And he said, that's exactly what I mean. So that was when I went to Mr. Beardsley and I said, you know, Michael's very serious about this.
I think that motivated everybody. And if we hadn't had the threat, I'm not sure it would have ever happened.
By now, the local newspapers had found out more about the chapel's interior and about the owner's plans to auction off the pieces inside. As upset as the public had been about the Adventists selling the property, they were even more upset to hear the historic building would soon be dismantled.
Mr. Dwyer went to the city of Auburn, asked the city manager at the time if the city would be interested in buying it because they had the public works garage was next door. And the answer was no. You know, we don't need to own something like that.
So then I says, well, I've been offered a lot more than that for it. And he says, well, we're not in the business of the historic. There was no historic aspirations on the city part at that time.
If City Hall wasn't interested, Mike Dwyer certainly had other potential buyers, but he wanted to give his hometown community a chance to save the buildings.
He said, you know, I could sell the pieces and parts, but what do you think? Is there anybody out there who's willing to buy the building and preserve the building?
At that time, the offer was, I guess when he smelled the tar and feathers cooking, he said, well, if you can come up with $500,000 at the end of 1 year, you can buy it.
If not, then he would hold the auction, sell the pieces as Duncan had done the appraisal work on.
But who in the community could come up with $500,000? Long gone were the days of Colonel Morgan and Dr. Sylvester Willard, who had donated so many thousands of dollars to the seminary. Gone were the days of wealthy industrialists whose mansions dotted Genesee Street and South Street. Even the seminary's final campaign had ended in failure before the seminary moved to Manhattan. At the end of 1988, it seemed likely that the chapel, like the seminary before it, would soon be just a memory.
We needed to have an organization to get involved in the project, and as the Community Preservation Committee was really all about preservation, that it was a natural to have that group involved. The big problem was that this organization had a net operating budget of about $2,500.
We're a community preservation organization. How can we continue to call ourselves that if we let this building go? So to me it was really, there was no choice. We had to do this or let's just, you know, disband, because you just couldn't let it go.
How could such a small group possibly come up with $500,000? Like Peter climbing out of the boat to walk on the water, it would take a step of faith. The preservationists devised a plan. The building would qualify for a matching grant if it were on a national or state register of historic places, but it would take a minor miracle to make it happen. But then, this building seems to have a history of divine intervention.
It was not even recognized as an historic building. But because of the imminent danger that this building was, and because of the intrinsic value of the building, it got attention quickly.
Believe it or not, in a 6-week period, it was on the state register, which is unheard of. It's bureaucracy at its finest is going through that process, and it was just, they were determined to make this thing happen.
As they made up their minds to save the chapel, the preservationists started finding out more about its history and about its Tiffany interior. Numerous experts came to appraise it and to praise it.
I get a lot of calls, and most of the calls end up being Iffany windows instead of Tiffany windows. Everybody would love to have a Tiffany window. So when you call to a little town in upstate New York and they think they have this marvelous thing, sometimes you're a little skeptical. But as soon as I walked in, I knew they really had a gem, and if anything, they had underestimated how important the windows and the work in the chapel are.
It was early January of 1989 when the rubber would meet the road for this small group of preservationists. The antiques dealer asked for $75,000 in the next few weeks.
At the same time, he would then give us the keys to the property, and we would take care of the gas and electric, we'd pay for the taxes, we'd mow the grass, we would take care of the insurance costs, all of the carrying costs. At the end of the year, the balance of the $425,000 is due. If you pay the money, you have the building. If you don't have the money raised, then what I do is I have the auction, and I tell everybody in the world that I gave them a chance and they couldn't do it.
The preservationists needed to act quickly. Frustrated with what he perceived as a lack of progress, the chapel's young owner decided to force their hand.
The deadline was getting close. They didn't have the money. So the newspapers called me up one day and they said, well, what are you going to do with it? And so I'd been to New York City before. I'd been to the Limelight. And so I told them, I said, well, if they don't buy it, I'm going to turn it into a strip club. And that's when all hell broke loose.
Newspapers ran with the story. The community was up in arms. The Seventh-day Adventists were mortified.
Oh, we had a fit. We didn't know what we were going to do. We certainly couldn't buy it back from them.
If it ever had gone into a bar, a strip club, a nightclub, whatever you want to call it, it'd be almost seem sacrilegious in a way.
I guess the word I would say, he's raping the place. Really.
Could the sounds of the pipe organ be replaced by electric guitar and drums? Could the Tiffany chandeliers be replaced by strobe lights and neon? 10 years later, Mike Dwyer would open this highly popular bar in downtown Auburn, full of visually compelling, attention-grabbing artifacts from Auburn and from all over the world. Could Willard Chapel have actually looked like this?
In some ways, people hate this man for what he did, but it became much easier to raise the money because the threat's there. You have to do it immediately or do this or it's going to be gone.
And I would like to know, and I never will, whether it was a threat or whether it was he really intended to do those things.
It was always hard for me to tell, how much how much sincerity was behind what he was saying.
Some people saw how ridiculous it was, although it could have been done because it was grandfathered in there that I could have done anything with the building that I wanted to do with it, and they couldn't have stopped me.
Would gargoyles sit where Jesus walked on water? With all the decades of connections between the chapel and the prison, could this have been the last one? Not if the Community Preservation Committee had anything to say about it.
The first part of this really was, I need 75 grand by the end of the week. How are we going to come up with this money?
With only days to act, they did what the professors had done in 1873. They decided to borrow the money.
We went out into the community with a handful of people who came back and said, I'll back 10,000, I'll back 20, I'll back 1.
I know my wife was not very happy when I came home and let her know about this.
We were all very excited when we finally got that and we paid the money. And then there was a sort of silence like, oh boy, this sort of collective sigh, like, oh, now what do we do?
They would still need to raise another $425,000 in 12 months. For a grassroots organization with only about 30 members, it was a formidable task. Newspapers provided plenty of favorable coverage, but it was the enthusiasm and sacrifice of the people that kept the effort alive. Architect Jim Beardsley moved back from North Carolina to volunteer full-time on fundraising. Kathy Scullin quit her job as a nurse to work full-time on the project.
It seemed like sometimes we'd come out of meetings and we were elated, and other times we were like, oh my gosh, what have we done? So it was a little bit up and down, but I think we never lost faith that we would be successful. At least that's what they kept telling me, and I believe them.
We wanted to have a community open house to really gauge the support, to see what people would be interested in helping out. And thousands of people came through the building. And we had a jar out in the lobby, and people were stuffing $10 and $20 bills in it, and that was the beginning of the process.
When they made the down payment, they also agreed to pay the operating costs. Insurance was more than $10,000 a year, plus taxes, plus the heating costs, which had driven the Adventists out of the building. The state provided a $30,000 grant to help with the costs. The state would be a major player in saving the chapel, but the Preservation Committee was also looking for private contributions.
It's tough in this neck of the woods. There's not a lot of money. We don't have any dominant industry that we can't go to a GE or a GM and say, hey, look, you're in this community, can you give us $1 million?
We approached the obvious influential, wealthy donors, and we didn't get very far. And the general question was that they didn't think we could, even if we were able to get it, they didn't feel we could hang on to it. But we decided we'd prove them wrong.
In the mail, we'd get, $2. We'd get, $5 checks. So, and I think really that's better for the survival of the organization, because it's a real community-based effort. I had one gentleman from New York City, this limousine comes driving in, and a gentleman gets out. He pulls a big wad of money out of his pocket and he wants to buy a chandelier. And I'm thinking, oh gee, boy, as much as we need that money, I just can't do that. You see, this is a complete design.
The outpouring of community support harkens back to 1873, when Colonel Morgan was moved by the support for the seminary, even from those who couldn't afford to give. While the threat to turn the building into a nightclub may have galvanized public support for saving the chapel, the $500,000 price tag may have turned some people away.
Why did he need $500,000? That's not what he paid for, the property. How much is enough? Let's take a reasonable profit and not double.
Many people in this small community thought that was too much money. They thought that this guy's making money on the deal. We didn't get support from a lot of local people because of that.
I mean, I was profiting on it, but I wasn't profiting on it like anybody could have.
Clearly he could have gotten a lot more if he broke it down and sold to individual collectors, because the collectors are all over the world, and they will pay a tremendous amount of money for a documented Tiffany window. And these windows are documented in the book that was put out by the studio in 1912. It lists the Auburn Chapel, it lists the windows and the mosaics and a number of other items.
And I wanted to make sure that if I sold it, that this would also be a way for the building to be kept intact forever.
When local foundations were hesitant to help, the volunteers took their plea nationwide.
And we sent probably 40 or 50 letters to selected foundations. And some of the gifts were quite substantial. I believe one was around $35,000.
We made wonderful relationships with the music community in Auburn. They jumped right up and they were gonna, perform concerts and draw people in, and that's really what happened. We had a lot of concerts.
No one argues that the Steer and Turner organ is a vibrant and indispensable part of the chapel. There has been much disagreement, however, about the instrument's origin.
The original chapel design definitely called for an organ, but it's unclear whether this was the organ that was specified and it perhaps was added later. There's a couple people who theorize that it was added later.
The wives' tale was that this organ wasn't original to this building, and since we've come here, we've learned that isn't true. The rest of the Welch building sits all on steel piers and steel girders supporting the floor. And the chapel has two laminated wood beams that run the length of the building, come right up under the organ. It reverberates like the soundboard in a violin or a stringed instrument would. When you sit here and the organ plays, you don't only hear the organ, you feel the organ right through the floor and in your seats. They would have just sat this on steel if there wasn't any music in here.
But if this organ was designed for this chapel, why does it conceal two of Tiffany's windows, making them visible only from the outside of the building?
Tiffany would not have wanted anything to cover up his work, so he obviously did not know that those pipes would be covering his window.
But what if all the windows went up first and the organ was added later?
We grew up with the story, and whether it's true or not, I have no idea, but that they had the wall up and then they had to take part of it down in order to get the organ in.
Then we found the Auburn newspaper with the dedication, and The architect is doing a walkthrough, and he describes the organ intact. So we know that was here, and we've eliminated that fallacy.
Not everyone is convinced.
I think the fact that they bricked over 2 windows may argue against that. The other thing is that the patterns, the stenciled patterns on the wall of the organ paneling itself are much simpler than the patterns that Tiffany did on liturgical furniture. So that says to me that it might not have been done by his craftsmen. It's not the same pattern, it's not as complex a pattern. My guess is that for the dedication they might have wheeled in a portable organ or just had a smaller organ that fit deeper into the apse, and then perhaps this one became available.
Several documents may be able to shed some light on its history. A brochure published by the seminary in 1939 says it was installed in 1896. That's 2 years after the chapel's dedication. However, the same brochure says the chapel itself was completed in 1896, not in 1894. Perhaps the most compelling evidence that this is the original organ is a newspaper article from May of 1894, 5 months before the chapel's dedication. The article describes a 2-manual Steer and Turner organ. The spelling of Steer is different, but the description perfectly matches the current organ. Could it be that this is the original organ, built right here in the chapel, but that it was installed very shortly after Tiffany had finished his work? This would allow for the differences in the stencil designs and for covering the stained glass. It would also explain the story of the torn-up walls. One thing is certain, the organ has inspired many generations.
I feel privileged and blessed to play with the beautiful ambiance of the building. It's very uplifting for my soul. I'm often awestruck that God inspired man to do these beautiful buildings and instruments of worship for the glorification of Him.
But the preservationists knew it would not be enough to simply buy the building. They needed a solid business plan to keep the money coming in.
The idea was to take the Welch building and use that as an income generator.
4 of the original classrooms, converted to apartments in the 1940s, were rented as offices. The Preservation Committee set up its headquarters in another. The 6th classroom, next to the kitchen, was used as a community room. When they took possession, they found more than a Tiffany chapel. The attic of the Welch building contained some very interesting historical treasures as well. There were blank diplomas from the seminary, military leave passes from World War II, and signatures from students who attended the seminary while the chapel was being built.
I looked up the rolls from the 1894. It goes into the 20th century, but they signed their name up there. It's all written up by the dormer.
The chapel was rented out for weddings, providing another steady source of income. Several state grants provided money for a new fire door between the Welch building and the chapel, and for a wheelchair access entrance and elevator. But the biggest help came in the summer of 1989.
We were able to have the #1 rated project in the state, and we got a $285,000 matching grant.
That was such a huge boost, to our efforts, because we were, we were 5 or 6 months into this campaign. We didn't have a lot of time left when you think about it, and there wasn't a lot of money there. There was a lot of enthusiasm, and we were hoping to sort of hit our stride. And this grant came along. It was just terrific news.
The hardworking members of the Preservation Committee kept sending out letters and making calls, and the donations kept trickling in. But as the end of the year approached, they were still short of their goal. Once again, they decided to borrow the remainder. Then, just 2 weeks before the deadline to buy, another plot twist blindsided the preservationists and put the chapel's future into jeopardy again.
The state had a rule that basically says you go out, have the appraisals done, and that becomes your purchase price. They don't want to see the person who owns the building being shorted. And at the time that we had the appraisals completed, it came in about $1.8 million. The state of New York said to us, well, you're only going to give him $500,000 for it. That's not fair. That doesn't meet our state laws.
Well, this is another thing. I could have backed out. I think I could have backed out of the deal at that point, and I still wanted the building saved.
The preservationists had tapped every resource and turned over every stone to raise $500,000 that year. There was no way they could raise another $1.3 million in 2 weeks.
So I kind of came up with an idea that I pitched to the state, and that was, can I have him give us a charitable contribution of the difference between what he's agreed to sell the building for and what these appraisals come back at? So in essence, we get a $1.3 million contribution on paper from the antique dealer, and he accepts the $500,000 cash that he had agreed to.
So the sale went through with $500,000, and then I also got a significant tax deduction on it.
It was one of those little glitches at the last minute that almost jeopardized the whole project.
In March of 1990, the final paperwork went through. But before he sold the buildings, Mike Dwyer removed one prominent piece of artwork from the Welch Building, a marble plaque by renowned sculptor Herbert Adams, bearing the likeness of Professor Ransom Bethune-Welch, holding a Bible and flanked by angels on either side. The slightly discolored wood in the hallway shows where this commemorative sculpture hung for more than 90 years. Today, the chapel is a National Historic Landmark, a proud part of Auburn's heritage and a prime draw for tourism.
Last year we had a TV crew come in for a show that's called Seasoned Traveler that's going to be airing next year, and they did the whole Finger Lakes region, and out of all the spots that they saw, this is the one they picked as their hidden gem in the Finger Lakes.
Last year, more than 20,000 visitors passed through the chapel doors. The last remaining vestige of the seminary, which once sent missionaries to the ends of the earth, now attracts visitors from all over the globe.
And every year the guest book, got fatter and fatter and fatter, and people came from all over the world. And when I say that, it sounds so weird. Why would somebody from Australia come here just to look at our Tiffany Chapel? And somehow they heard about it.
While tourists come from all over the world, many local residents are surprised to find they have a personal connection to the chapel.
My paternal grandparents were married there in 1899, and we wanted to get married there as well. They got married in August in 1899, and we did it 100 years later.
My great-great-grandfather graduated from seminary, left, and had a full career as a minister in northern Illinois, which is where I was born. I'm back here in Auburn, and I'm not even realizing that my great-great-grandfather went to school here. So that really was a deja vu experience for me.
The chapel is still run by the Community Preservation Committee, a nonprofit agency with 3 part-time employees and a modest annual budget. Concerts draw thousands of visitors each year. The people who were up in arms when Mike Dwyer threatened to turn the church into a nightclub don't seem to mind the rock and roll reverberating off the Tiffany windows. The chapel survived the renovation plans that could have destroyed the Tiffany artwork in 1929. It dodged the wrecking ball when the Adventists bought it in 1957, and it narrowly escaped being turned into a nightclub in 1990. Today, the chapel faces another threat: time. Because of its high salt content, the sandstone on the exterior has been eroding for decades. Dr. Richard Livingston published a scientific study about the problem in the mid-90s. Since then, the red stone surface has gotten noticeably worse.
So you get holes like that, and then as they wither out, the whole thing will split off.
The problem is only going to get worse, and then there's the roof.
Ultimately, it will be necessary to replace the slate roof, either significant repairs to the copper gutters and flashing or possible replacement. They have finite lifespans.
The windows on the sides of the chapel were recently cleaned and restored, and a major renovation project is in the works to restore the chapel to the way it looked in 1894. The most noticeable differences are the color of the paint on the walls, originally a terracotta, and the stencils on the pipes of the organ. It won't be cheap, But these efforts will help keep this Tiffany treasure accessible for generations to come.
We have set the template. We have established state support and the state being a partner.
And it's in our best interest, in our enlightened self-interest, to preserve something as magnificent as Willard Chapel.
After surviving 3 major threats that could have destroyed it, the chapel is alive and well. And the seminary that once flourished in Auburn is now thriving again in New York City. Auburn Theological Seminary does not confer degrees, but continues to stress its frontier spirit while embracing a new mission.
That has burgeoned into 2 educational centers focused on Christian leaders and institutions, strengthening them, and then a center for multi-faith education that brings people together across lines of religious difference, Christians, Jews, Muslims, and others.
Innovative programs like the Face-to-Face, Faith-to-Faith program bring together teenagers of different faiths from places torn by religious conflict.
And so they go back and work for at least a year with the Face-to-Face program on the pressing issues that face their communities. In Israel and the West Bank, it would be what we know there. It's peacemaking in that region. Same would be true in Northern Ireland. And then in places like South Africa, HIV/AIDS and education around that issue, that's the pressing social issue for them.
For more than 130 years, Auburn graduates traveled around the world to win new converts to Christ. The mission today has changed.
Conversion is not the goal. Conversion is not the goal. All of us from our different religious traditions are called to witness to others about how God has revealed God's self to us. And that would be as true for Christians as it would be for Jews, as it would be for Muslims. I mean, you have to, or others, or how you understand deity or the power beyond oneself, or whatever it is for Buddhists and others.
Guido Verbeck, the famous missionary to Japan, wrote that the Buddhists were a strange set of men whose teachings were instigated by the father of lies himself. In his commencement speech in 1890, Reverend Courtney Hughes Fenn described Islam as the most resolute opposer of the religion of Jesus Christ. How would these men, and Auburn's fervent evangelical founders, embrace the seminary's new role?
They recognize that simply embracing a set of doctrines is not a matter of signing on the dotted line of a set of propositions, but of having your whole life reshaped by what Jesus Christ was about. And Jesus Christ was about the repair of the world. They were ready for whatever the world threw their way. And I think that they would have been ready for these new social realities that God has thrown their way.
In Auburn, the Seventh-day Adventist Church enjoys worship at its new building on Prospect Street. It's not fancy or elegant, but it's much more convenient and much easier to heat. The women of the congregation still provide free clothing and household goods through the Adventist Community Services outreach. The Adventists have many fond memories of their beloved Willard Chapel, and they have this reminder of their 30 years there. This Tiffany communion table they took with them when they moved. Instead of facing criticism for selling the building, they are now honored by the community for their role in preserving it. The story of Willard Chapel has a happy ending for everyone involved. The seminary is going strong on Broadway. The Seventh-day Adventists found an affordable church home. The antiques dealer doubled his investment, and this Tiffany treasure is preserved for future generations.
I know that the Tiffany's a one-of-a-kind chapel, but I believe the people that we were working together to save the chapel were a one-of-a-kind, a one-of-a-lifetime group of people that came together, and it was magic.
I think they've done a fine job of bringing it back, keeping it from whatever Mike Dwyer was going to do with it.
The threat was, there was never really a threat. People took it as a threat. It was more of a ploy to get people off their, to either go for it or not go for it.
Mike really, whether he meant to by design or not, really did a lot for the community.
The people should give Seventh-day Adventists a lot of credit.
They, through their hard work and elbow grease, they saved it, so it could be taken over the way it is.
In any community, and Auburn is no exception, there are people who see things and say, why doesn't somebody do something about that? And they usually point to someone else. You got to do something about that. What we had and continue to have in Auburn, we're blessed with people who heard that message and said, I'm going to do something about it.
If you believe in a specific purpose and you have a mission and you get together with the right people, you can do just about anything.
This is my Father's word, and to my listening ears, all nature sings and round me rings the music of the spheres. This is my Father's world. I rest me in the thought of rocks and trees, of skies and seas, his hand the wonders wrought. This is my Father's world. The birds their carols raise, the morning light, the lily white, declare their